"Happy birthday, Mom," David said softly, his eyes briefly meeting Margaret's before shifting to the view outside the large bay window. Margaret had spent the morning preparing her modest apartment, placing a small vase of fresh tulips on the dining table and carefully arranging a homemade chocolate cake she had baked with her own hands. She had hoped for a quiet celebration, a day marked by the presence of her son and perhaps a few close friends. But the apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. David's voice was calm, almost casual, yet the words that followed carried an edge Margaret could not immediately place. "Are you happy living here?" The question was simple, seemingly innocent, but it struck Margaret like a sudden draft through a closed window. She paused, measuring her response, feeling the weight of years and the subtle changes in David's demeanor since he had started his life in the city, building his fortune and drifting further from the home she had once shared with him. Margaret studied him closely. His tailored navy blazer fit perfectly, his wristwatch gleamed under the morning light, and there was a faint smell of his cologne lingering in the air, all markers of his successful life that now seemed to highlight the gap between them. She noted the gentle way he had avoided sitting too close to her, the polite but distant tone in his speech, and the quiet tension that had begun to thread through their interactions over the past months. Margaret kept her expression neutral, her lips pressed together as she placed a fork beside the untouched cake, each movement deliberate, controlled, revealing nothing yet reflecting everything. She remembered the small apartment they had lived in years ago, the cramped kitchen where she had taught him to bake cookies, the narrow hallways they had run down as children, and the living room filled with laughter and late-night conversations. Those memories collided with the current reality. David's question was more than curiosity. It carried an implication, a subtle suggestion that her contentment mattered less than the arrangement of the life he now controlled. Margaret silently observed him, taking in the calculated calm in his posture, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted briefly to the window before returning to hers, as if testing her reaction. She thought about the walls around her, the furniture carefully chosen to feel cozy, the sunlight streaming across the floorboards, and she realized that the space that had once felt like her sanctuary now carried a new weight, a quiet judgment. The air between them thickened, filled with unspoken words and the history of a bond stretched thin by distance and unacknowledged sacrifices. Margaret moved to the window, placing her hands lightly on the sill, looking out at the street below where children played and neighbors walked dogs, the ordinary life continuing while her own world had been quietly shifted by the implication of a question. She turned back to David, maintaining her calm composure, and allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the query without revealing the storm of reflection it had sparked within her. Her mind cataloged the moments, the letters, the conversations, and the subtle changes in routines, all weaving together to form a map of how her life had shifted imperceptibly under the weight of his growing independence and distance. Margaret's eyes lingered on David's face, noting the fleeting softness before it hardened again, the gentle curiosity that masked a careful calculation, and she allowed herself to imagine the life he now led, filled with opportunities she had supported from the sidelines, quietly, without expectation of recognition. She thought of the cake, the tulips, the quiet apartment, and recognized that this moment, brief as it was, reflected decades of love, guidance, and the gradual evolution of their relationship, a delicate balance of pride, affection, and the subtle ache of separation. As David shifted slightly, adjusting his sleeve and glancing once more toward the window, Margaret let a faint smile pass across her face, a controlled acknowledgement of his presence, a reflection of patience honed over years, and a silent message that she understood more than he suspected, that she held her own strength within the quiet dignity of her life, unspoken yet fully present, a calm before the unfolding of the day's understated revelation. Margaret placed the fork down beside her untouched slice of cake and walked slowly to the small living room window, her eyes following the movement of the neighborhood below. She had always appreciated the quiet mornings, the subtle rhythm of the streets, the familiar faces passing by, yet today the space felt heavier, as though every detail around her carried an unspoken message. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting slatted shadows across the floor, and she noted how even the simple pattern of light and shadow seemed to mirror the complexities of her relationship with David. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh flowers, the tulips on the table still vibrant. Yet Margaret could not shake the awareness of how carefully arranged every element of her life had become a reflection of her own resilience. She moved to straighten a cushion on the sofa, her hands brushing lightly over the fabric, and remembered the countless mornings spent preparing this home with meticulous care, the way she had balanced her own needs against those of her family, often placing them above her own comfort. Now, she observed the subtle shifts, the small indications that life had quietly changed around her, that the dynamics she had known for decades had shifted imperceptibly, but with profound impact. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the framed photographs lining the walls, snapshots of birthdays, holidays, and milestones long past, and she reflected on the effort, the dedication, and the love embedded within each captured moment. She allowed herself to acknowledge the faint pang of solitude, the quiet realization that her son's achievements had created distance, a gulf that had widened over the years without overt confrontation. As she moved to the kitchen counter to set down her teacup, she paused, noting the way the sunlight highlighted the edges of the counter, the gleam of the polished surface, and she thought of how these details had always brought her a sense of order and calm. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the brief silence, a measured reminder of time passing, and Margaret found herself contemplating the pattern of small gestures, subtle words, and nuanced behaviors that together painted a portrait of a relationship evolving beyond simple explanation. She considered the quiet dignity she maintained in her life, the unspoken understanding that her influence and care had helped shape the environment her son now inhabited. Yet she allowed herself to recognize that the acknowledgement of her contributions had become increasingly rare. Margaret took a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on her shoulders, and allowed her mind to catalog the minor adjustments and overlooked details that spoke volumes about the current state of her family dynamics. She reflected on the balance between her patience and her self-respect, the way she had learned to observe without immediate reaction, to listen without interjection, to note without accusation. In the gentle quiet, Margaret considered the next steps, the ways she might engage without compromising her own composure, and the possibilities for asserting her presence subtly but unmistakably. She imagined the interactions yet to come, the conversations over shared meals, the casual comments and glances, each a test of awareness and intention, and she resolved to approach them with deliberate attention and measured grace. Her thoughts returned to the simple pleasures of her environment, the way sunlight touched the wooden floor, the gentle hum of distant traffic, the faint aroma of the chocolate cake now slightly cooler, and she allowed herself a moment of calm, a quiet acknowledgement of the life she had carefully curated and the strength she carried within it. Margaret moved back toward the dining area, adjusting a chair slightly, and in the stillness she felt the interplay of observation and patience, the careful calibration of presence and restraint, knowing that in this balance lay the quiet power of her understanding and the potential for clarity in the unfolding hours of the day. Margaret moved to the small bookshelf in the corner, her fingers brushing over the spines of well-worn novels and family albums. Each photograph captured a moment frozen in time. David as a boy with a mischievous smile, summer afternoons spent in the yard, holidays marked with laughter and warmth, a testament to the years of care she had poured into nurturing a family. She carefully lifted a photo of David graduating high school, noting the pride in his eyes and the subtle hints of ambition that had always driven him. The apartment felt quieter now, the faint hum of the heater mingling with the distant sounds of the city below, a reminder that the world moved steadily outside while she observed its patterns from her own space. Margaret placed the photo back and adjusted a small lamp on the side table, the warm glow spilling across the polished wood surface, creating pockets of light and shadow that seemed to echo the complexities of her relationship with her son. She thought of the subtle changes in his behavior over the past few months, the curt responses, the careful avoidance of certain topics, the way he had started consulting Victoria on decisions she once shared with him freely. Margaret took a deep breath and poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling gently in the sunlight, offering a momentary comfort as she considered the layers of observation she had gathered. Each smile he gave, each polite nod, each carefully chosen phrase contributed to a growing understanding that the dynamic had shifted. She remembered the evenings when they would sit together, her teaching him about responsibility, about choices and consequences, and now realized that those lessons had been absorbed in a way that created distance rather than closeness. Margaret's eyes lingered on the empty chair across from her, imagining the quiet conversations that could have taken place, the opportunities to reconnect that had been replaced by distance and unspoken expectations. She allowed herself to consider the contrast between the bustling life David led outside her apartment walls and the quiet dignity she maintained within them, the balance of independence and restraint, the subtle signals of awareness she could now interpret with clarity. As she sipped her tea, she noted the small details around the room, the gentle sway of a curtain in the breeze, the faint aroma of the chocolate cake now resting on the counter, the orderly arrangement of her home, each element a testament to her careful attention and perseverance. Margaret reflected on the patience required to navigate these interactions, the way she had learned to observe without interruption, to assess without immediate judgment, and to hold her own perspective in a space where she was often overlooked. She considered the upcoming days, the conversations yet to occur, and the gentle but deliberate measures she could take to assert her presence without conflict, knowing that the awareness she carried was a quiet strength that spoke volumes. The afternoon light shifted, casting new shadows across the room, and Margaret felt a renewed sense of vigilance and composure, a readiness to face the evolving dynamics with measured grace, the knowledge that her influence and understanding remained intact even when her voice was not immediately heard. Margaret rose from the chair and moved toward the small dining table, her fingers lightly grazing the polished surface as she considered the details she had arranged for the morning. Each item, from the freshly polished silverware to the neatly folded napkins, carried with it a sense of order and calm that contrasted with the subtle unease she felt. In the presence of David, she poured herself another cup of tea, the steam curling into the air as she listened to the faint sounds of the city outside, cars passing, distant laughter of children, all reminders of the life moving beyond the walls of her apartment. Her gaze fell upon the small stack of letters she had received over the past weeks, each containing updates about David's life, his successes, and the intricate planning of his expanding business. And she considered the careful phrasing and measured tone, realizing that behind the civility lay an unspoken pressure and expectation. Margaret adjusted the position of the tulips on the table, their vibrant petals catching the morning light, and reflected on how these small touches of care had always been her way of maintaining a sense of connection, a reminder of her presence and influence, subtle yet unmistakable. She thought about the weekends spent baking with David when he was a boy, the afternoons filled with laughter, learning, and the quiet confidence she instilled in him, and contrasted those memories with the present, noting the change in his tone, the careful wording of his questions, and the way his eyes held a guarded curiosity that suggested a new understanding, one she had not yet fully grasped. Margaret sat back slightly, taking in the arrangement of her surroundings, the soft hum of the heater, the angled sunlight creating long shadows across the floor, and she allowed herself a quiet assessment of the subtle signals around her, the tone of voice, the glance that lingered a moment too long, the pause before a response. Each element contributed to a growing awareness, an understanding of the layered dynamic in which she now found herself, and she recognized that her patience, her attentiveness, and her quiet observance were her tools for navigating this evolving relationship. The aroma of the chocolate cake mingled with the fresh scent of the tulips, and Margaret felt a moment of calm clarity, an acknowledgement of the life she had built and the careful stewardship of her own dignity and presence within it. She reflected on the interplay of observation and intention, the quiet power held in knowing, and the ability to influence outcomes through measured presence rather than immediate reaction. As she moved to straighten the edge of the tablecloth, the folds crisp under her fingers, she considered the forthcoming interactions. With David, the opportunities to communicate through subtle gestures, the power of a composed demeanor, and the strength inherent in maintaining her perspective. Margaret glanced once more at the window, noting the play of light across the neighboring buildings, the rhythm of life continuing outside, and she felt a renewed sense of readiness, a composed anticipation for the next phase of the day, confident that her awareness and discernment would guide her through the unfolding moments with precision and grace. Margaret moved quietly to the living room couch and sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she surveyed the space around her. The soft light of the afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting a warm glow over the room and highlighting the delicate arrangement of books, photographs, and keepsakes that filled the shelves. Each object seemed to hold a memory, a piece of the life she had carefully cultivated, a testament to the years she had devoted to nurturing her family and maintaining her home with attention and care. She glanced at the small dining table, the chocolate cake now slightly cooled, the teacups arranged with precision, and she noted how these ordinary details carried a quiet significance, reflecting her meticulous nature and the effort she invested in creating harmony. Margaret's eyes lingered on the framed pictures along the wall, recalling moments when David had been a boy full of curiosity and energy, the laughter echoing through the rooms, the simple joys of shared activities that now felt distant yet vividly remembered. She considered the subtle shifts in his behavior over recent months, the careful choice of words, the measured expressions, and the hints of restraint that suggested a growing awareness of boundaries and expectations. Margaret sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle her thoughts, and allowed herself to reflect on the importance of observation, the careful interpretation of gestures, tones, and pauses, each providing insight into the current state of her family dynamic. The apartment was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock, the distant hum of traffic outside, and the soft rustle of leaves from a nearby tree, creating an atmosphere that encouraged contemplation and careful assessment. Margaret considered the interplay between her own patience and the subtleties of David's actions, recognizing that her awareness was a form of quiet strength, a tool that allowed her to navigate the complexities of their interactions with composure and clarity. She thought about the coming evening, the conversations yet to take place, and the ways in which she could assert her presence without confrontation, relying on observation and subtle guidance rather than overt control. Each detail of her environment, the light, the arrangement of furniture, the placement of personal items, served as a reminder of her careful stewardship and the power inherent in maintaining composure and dignity. Margaret adjusted a cushion on the couch, noting the texture beneath her fingers, and reflected on the balance she maintained between engagement and discretion, the ability to act with intentionality without disturbing the equilibrium of her carefully observed surroundings. The afternoon unfolded slowly, with Margaret attuned to every nuance, every quiet sound, and every slight movement, preparing herself to respond with measured consideration to the evolving dynamics, confident in her ability to maintain presence and influence through subtlety and insight. Margaret moved to the small study in the corner of her apartment, her fingers tracing the edges of the stack of papers neatly arranged on the desk. Sunlight fell across the room in a diagonal beam, illuminating the organized chaos of notes, letters, and small mementos collected over years of careful attention. She picked up a letter from David, reading it slowly, each word measured and precise, reflecting his deliberate tone and the subtle distance that had developed between them. Margaret placed it back carefully and straightened the papers, a ritual that grounded her, allowing her to process the layers of observation she had gathered over recent weeks. She took a deep breath, listening to the faint sounds from the street below, children laughing, a dog barking, the distant rumble of a passing bus, and she allowed the quiet to sharpen her awareness, each detail feeding into a mental map of interactions, gestures, and intentions. Her eyes moved to the photograph of David and Victoria at a recent celebration, smiles bright and polished, yet Margaret noted the stiffness in posture, the calculated angles of body language, subtle cues that revealed more than the cheerful surface suggested. She picked up a notebook and began making mental notes of patterns she had observed, the way certain phrases were delivered, the timing of responses, the careful balance of civility and restraint. Margaret reflected on her own calm, the way she had maintained composure in every interaction, never allowing impatience or frustration to dictate her response, understanding that quiet observation could reveal more than confrontation ever could. She looked at the table where the chocolate cake rested, slightly warmed by the afternoon sun, the tulips leaning gently in the vase, and considered how each small detail of her environment could serve as both a marker of care and a tool for reflection, a way to gauge the rhythms and intentions of those around her. Margaret moved to the window and straightened the curtains slightly, noticing the angle of the sunlight on the floor, the shadows shifting as the day progressed, and she thought about the subtle ways she could assert presence, through careful placement of objects, through the measured tone of voice in conversation, through the calm attention she paid to detail. The room, filled with quiet light and orderly arrangement, became a space where Margaret could think with clarity, observe without interruption, and plan with patience, each choice deliberate, each movement reflective of her awareness. She sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle her thoughts, considering the possibilities for upcoming interactions, the ways in which she could guide the conversation, maintain composure, and ensure that her perspective was present and acknowledged, even if indirectly. Margaret allowed herself a moment to appreciate the stability she had created, the careful maintenance of her surroundings, and the strength that came from measured observation, knowing that her attention, patience, and quiet presence were as powerful as any spoken word in shaping the unfolding dynamics of the day. Margaret returned to the dining area and adjusted the chairs slightly, her movements deliberate and measured as she surveyed the room once more. The sunlight had shifted, painting warm tones across the floor and casting elongated shadows that traced the contours of the furniture and objects she had carefully arranged. She poured herself another cup of tea, the aroma mingling with the faint scent of the tulips and the lingering chocolate from the cake, creating a subtle comfort that contrasted with the tension she sensed beneath the surface of the day. Margaret's eyes moved across the room, taking in the photographs on the walls, the carefully organized shelves, the small details that spoke of years of care and dedication, and she allowed herself to acknowledge the quiet power in her presence, the way her attention to detail conveyed influence without a word. She reflected on the interactions with David. Earlier, his measured tone, the precise choice of words, the hints of consideration masked by casual phrasing, and she considered the implications of his questions, the nuances of his inquiries that suggested both curiosity and an unspoken awareness of her attentiveness. Margaret sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle her thoughts, and she allowed herself to catalog the subtle signs, the micro-expressions, and the timing of responses that together revealed the underlying dynamics of their relationship. The apartment was filled with soft light and the gentle hum of distant traffic, a backdrop for her contemplation, and she appreciated the clarity that came from observing without immediate reaction, noting the way shadows shifted, the way the air carried the faint sound of children playing outside, and the manner in which the day unfolded in layers of subtle observation. Margaret adjusted a cushion on the sofa, noting the texture beneath her fingers, and considered the small, deliberate movements that conveyed attention and care, the ways in which her awareness could guide future interactions without overt intervention. She reflected on the balance between patience and insight, the quiet understanding that her presence alone could influence the tone of conversation, the subtle authority derived from experience and observation rather than words. As she moved toward the window to straighten the blinds slightly, she noted the way sunlight illuminated different corners of the room, the patterns shifting as the day progressed, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of maintaining a composed, measured space in which she could observe, reflect, and plan. Margaret considered the upcoming moments, the conversations yet to unfold, the small gestures and words that would carry meaning, and she prepared herself to navigate them with precision, confidence, and quiet strength, knowing that her awareness, patience, and composure would guide the interactions and maintain her presence and influence within the evolving family dynamic. Margaret walked to the small balcony, the cool air brushing against her face as she looked out over the city streets below. She noted the gentle sway of tree branches in the afternoon breeze, the rhythmic footsteps of neighbors walking home, and the distant hum of traffic, each sound grounding her in the present. The apartment felt alive with subtle energy, though quiet enough for reflection, and Margaret allowed herself to observe each movement, each shadow cast by the shifting sunlight across the floor. She returned her gaze to the interior of the apartment, noting the arrangement of personal items, the neat stack of books on the side table, the carefully folded napkins beside the unused teacups, the vase of tulips slightly leaning as if nodding in agreement with her thoughts. Every detail, no matter how small, carried a significance she could read, a language of care and attention that spoke to her dedication over the years. Margaret sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth spread through her, and she reflected on the nuanced interactions of the morning, the questions asked, the pauses taken, the subtle inflections in David's tone, all weaving together to reveal the layers beneath the surface of conversation. She considered the power of quiet observation, the way a careful glance or a measured gesture could communicate as much as words, and she acknowledged the influence she retained simply by maintaining presence and attentiveness. Her mind traced the patterns of behavior she had noticed over the past weeks, the ways in which David and Victoria navigated their interactions with care, the micro-expressions and shifts in posture that suggested intentions and awareness she could interpret without confrontation. Margaret adjusted the position of a cushion on the balcony chair, noting its texture and the soft warmth of sunlight on the fabric, and she thought about the upcoming hours, the conversations that might unfold, the ways she could guide them through subtlety and insight. She observed the light moving across the walls, the interplay of shadows and reflections, and allowed the scene to anchor her thoughts, each moment providing clarity and a renewed sense of composure. The faint aroma of the chocolate cake lingered in the kitchen, blending with the freshness of the tulips, and Margaret felt a quiet reassurance in the continuity of the small details she had shaped and maintained. She considered the potential for gentle influence through attentiveness, through the steady calm of her voice and the deliberate positioning of her presence in shared spaces, recognizing the power inherent in her careful awareness. Margaret's eyes returned to the city below, watching as life moved with steady, measured rhythm, and she felt the balance of patience and insight settle within her, a confidence grounded in observation and understanding. Every subtle movement, every calculated pause, every nuanced glance became part of a larger pattern she could read and respond to, a reflection of her quiet strength and the control she maintained through perception rather than overt assertion. As the day continued, Margaret remained poised and attentive, fully aware of the evolving dynamics around her, prepared to engage with clarity, composure, and the quiet authority she had cultivated over a lifetime of careful observation. Margaret returned to the living room, moving with the quiet precision that had become her habit, her eyes scanning the apartment with careful attention to every detail she had arranged. The sunlight had begun to soften as the afternoon edged toward early evening, casting gentle hues across the walls and illuminating the photographs that lined the shelves. She paused by the small table where the chocolate cake rested, noting the subtle warmth left in the air, the gentle aroma mingling with the fresh tulips, a reminder of her presence and the care she had invested in creating a calm and orderly environment. Margaret considered the unfolding of the day, the layers of observation she had gathered, the nuances in David's speech, the precise timing of his gestures, and the slight hesitations in Victoria's movements, all of which told a story of careful calculation and awareness beneath the surface of ordinary interactions. She sat in the armchair by the window, folding her hands in her lap, and allowed herself to reflect on the quiet authority she held simply by being present, by observing and noting without immediate reaction, by understanding the dynamics that others assumed she had not noticed. The soft hum of traffic outside and the distant chatter of pedestrians created a backdrop of normalcy, contrasting with the heightened awareness Margaret carried within the apartment, each sound and movement contributing to a subtle map of behavior and intention. She sipped her tea, the warmth settling her thoughts, and allowed her mind to organize the observations she had made, the careful assessment of tone, body language, and phrasing, and how each moment revealed patterns and unspoken messages. Margaret adjusted a cushion on the sofa, noting the texture beneath her fingers, the slight give of the fabric under gentle pressure, and she reflected on the balance she maintained between patience and insight, understanding that her quiet composure could influence outcomes as effectively as words or actions. She rose slowly and walked to the balcony once more, letting the cool air brush against her skin, observing the city below with its steady rhythm of activity, and noting the interplay of light and shadow across the streets, as though the world itself mirrored the subtle dynamics she was navigating within her own home. Margaret returned to the apartment, straightening the arrangement of personal items on the side tables, ensuring that everything was in its proper place. And she considered how the careful curation of her surroundings reflected not only her attention to detail, but also the clarity and composure she maintained in every interaction. The late afternoon light continued to shift, stretching the shadows longer across the floor, and Margaret felt a sense of quiet satisfaction in her awareness, in her ability to read subtle cues and maintain a measured presence. She settled back into the armchair, taking another sip of tea, her thoughts steady and deliberate, appreciating the strength in observation, the power in patience, and the calm authority that came from understanding the rhythms of her family's interactions, prepared to engage with clarity and insight as the day moved toward evening.